The world exploded in a storm of noise and chaos. One moment, we were pushing through a hedgerow, the humid air thick and still. The next, the jungle itself was screaming. The man in front of me, the second in our column, simply collapsed, a puppet whose strings had been cut. He hadn't made a sound. Through the ringing in my ears, I heard the flat crack of a sniper's rifle, a sound distinct from the panicked return fire that immediately erupted from our own ranks. Then came the screaming. It was a desperate primal sound, a man begging for a life that was already slipping away. Chaos is a funny thing. It's not just loud, it's disorienting. It strips away training and leaves you with raw instinct. Two more guys, driven by that instinct to help a fallen brother, rushed forward. The hidden rifle cracked twice more, and they fell beside the first. 3 men down, just like that. From the other side of the hedgerow, the point man from our second column, hearing the firefight, came running around to help. A single shot dropped him in his tracks. 4 men. I hugged the dirt, my heart hammering against my ribs, trying to make sense of the geometry of death. Where was it coming from? We were pinned, caught in a perfectly laid trap by a ghost we couldn't see. Another man went down. 5, all from a single invisible sniper. Panic began to curdle in my gut. I saw our platoon leader, a young lieutenant from California named Lane, fumbling with his radio handset, his face pale and his eyes wide with terror. He was yelling, but his words were lost in the cacophony. He was losing it. We were all losing it. It felt like the end of the world, a violent, meaningless end in a patch of dirt halfway around the globe. But it wasn't the beginning of the end. For me, in a way, it was the culmination of everything that had started just a few months prior, when I first stepped off a plane and into the bewildering heart of the war. The first thing that hit me in Vietnam wasn't the heat, though that came soon enough. It was the color red. Stepping off the commercial jet in Pleiku, I walked onto a world saturated in it. The dirt was a deep, rusty red clay, and it was everywhere. It was caked on the tires of the bus they herded us onto, smeared across its windows, and ground into the floorboards in a thick, muddy paste. The bus itself was a cage with wire mesh over the windows, and it rattled down a dirt road like a tin can full of rocks. This was the starkest possible contrast to the spit and polish world of stateside training, where every surface gleamed. Here, filth was the norm. It was a shock to the system. They took us to a crude base, a collection of tents and temporary structures, and fed us. As I sat there trying to choke down a meal, I saw them, the real veterans, the men who had just come in from the field. They were sitting in the shade, apart from us new guys, and they looked like creatures from another planet. Their uniforms, their skin, their boots, everything was stained with that same red mud. They were scruffy, unshaven, their eyes holding a weary distance I couldn't yet comprehend. I remember thinking how unkempt they looked, how utterly they had let themselves go. It was a mind-boggling sight. I didn't realize then that in a few weeks I would look just like them, that red clay would become a second skin. We spent only a night or two at Pleiku, a processing point where they sorted us out like so much equipment. From there, I was assigned to the 1st Cavalry Division at Nkei. The 1st Cav was Airmobile, a modern fighting force, and our introduction to that reality was a week-long training school for all new arrivals, from cooks to infantrymen. The most memorable part was the rappelling tower. Because we moved by helicopter, there was always a chance we'd have to rappel into a hot landing zone. So they made us climb this tall, menacing tower and go over the side. The first time was just with the harness. The second time, you had to do it with all your web gear and your weapon, and you were supposed to shout Geronimo or some other nonsense on the way down. I was so focused on not making a mistake that I forgot to yell, so they made me climb all the way back up and do it again. I wasn't exactly scared, not in the traditional sense. I had adopted an attitude that the Army wasn't going to kill me in training. Thousands of guys had done this before me, therefore it was survivable. It wasn't fun, and my stomach did a few flips, but I was determined to just get through it. That mentality would serve me well in the months to come. After the school, I joined my unit. They were out in the field pulling perimeter security for an artillery battery perched on a mountaintop. A helicopter dropped me off, and I was walked down to my new home. They assigned me a position on the line with another guy, and that was it. My war had begun. The days were long and relatively relaxed, but at night the world shrank to the few feet in front of your foxhole. Every shadow, every rustle of leaves was a potential threat. We guarded that perimeter for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a week. We didn't see a single enemy combatant. It was a gentle introduction, a calm before the inevitable storm. From there, we rotated back to the main base camp at Adcock for a time, pulling security on what they called the Green Line, a cleared area of bushes and shrubbery just outside the main wire. It was during this period that my path took a slight turn. They discovered I had a knack for reading a map. In the jungle, where landmarks are few and the terrain is a confusing maze of green, that was a valuable skill. Many of the guys just couldn't get the hang of it. So they tested me, and soon after, I was pulled from the regular rifle platoon and made a forward observer for the mortars, assigned to the 1st Platoon. My job was now to carry a radio, move with the infantry, and be the eyes of the mortar crews, calling in fire when needed. This new role led to one of the most unique experiences of my entire tour. My new company commander called me and another forward observer, a guy named Robert, into his office. He had a special assignment for us. We were to go out to a series of popular forces camps, small outposts manned by local Vietnamese militiamen, the equivalent of our National Guard. Our job was simple: provide them with a link to American artillery. We were their insurance policy. If their camp came under attack, we were the ones who would call in the big guns. For the entire month of August, Reber and I lived out there, rotating between 3 different camps. A helicopter would drop us off, and we'd replace the 2 GIs who had been there the week before. The camps were rudimentary, small compounds surrounded by a high dirt dike and rings of wire. The local men would come in at night for security and then disperse during the day to tend to their fields and families. For us, it was mostly a waiting game. We laid around, cleaned our weapons, and listened to the radio. We never once had to call in an artillery strike, but that didn't mean it was uneventful. At each of the 3 camps, we had to call in a medevac for a completely different reason. At the first camp, some villagers brought in an old man who had badly injured his ankle with a machete. The wound was severe, and he was in critical condition. We got on the radio, and a helicopter came and whisked him away. At the second camp, the local partisans booby-trapped the front gate one night. At dawn, as the first 2 militiamen went to leave, the device detonated. The blast caught them both, leaving them with devastating injuries. Again, we called for a medevac. The third camp was the worst. Just outside the front gate, maybe 100 feet away, was a garbage pit. We'd walked past it a dozen times. Lying in the trash was the burnt, melted fiberglass tube of an M72 Law, a shoulder-fired anti-tank rocket. We could see the fins of the rocket still inside, but we never gave it a second thought. One day, Reber walked out the gate and saw a local man scavenging in that trash dump, apparently looking for something of value. Just as Reber looked up, the man pulled the live rocket out of the tube to examine his find. Reber screamed at him to put it down, but the man, likely not understanding, kept inspecting it. He was holding it by the fins and trying to knock some dirt off, tapped the nose of the rocket on the ground. The explosion was instantaneous and devastating. The man was caught in the epicenter of the blast. Reber called for the medevac while I, shaking, ran out to do what I could. I tried to render aid, but his injuries were catastrophic. It was a hopeless task. The image of that horrific scene is one that has never left me. He was just a man trying to survive. We got him on the helicopter, but I doubt he survived. I have never in all the years since met another veteran who had that kind of duty, living among the Vietnamese people in that way, a detached observer to their daily tragedies. It was an odd, intimate glimpse into their world. At each camp, there was usually one person who could speak a little English. At the first camp, a man named Lai took us under his wing and helped us understand our surroundings. But for the most part, the Vietnamese were distant. The language barrier was a huge wall between us. Still, we found small ways to connect. I remember playing volleyball with some of them at one camp. It was a brief moment of normalcy in a completely abnormal world. After that month-long assignment, I rejoined my company. They had been pulling bridge security, guarding the vital transportation routes from saboteurs. I spent a couple of weeks with them on that duty, a stationary and monotonous job, before we shifted tactics. The word came down for us to start conducting more patrols, moving out from the relative safety of the fire bases and actively searching for the enemy. Sometimes they called it movement to contact. Other times, search and destroy. To us, it was just walking. Endless walking through jungle and rice paddies, always vigilant, always waiting for something to happen. For months, nothing did. July, August, September passed in a blur of patrols, heat, and insects. We saw signs of the enemy, but we never made contact. Then in October, our luck ran out. We were on patrol, walking along just as we had for days, when a single shot rang out. One of our guys, a big muscular fellow from Nebraska named Jessen, was carrying an M60 machine gun on his shoulder. A sniper, hidden in a tree up ahead, took him down with a single, precise shot. The first moments after a man is hit are pure, unadulterated chaos. Everyone hit the dirt. Someone started screaming, "Medic! Medic!" Our medic, a guy we all called Doc Gutierrez, was momentarily disoriented. The calls were coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. He took a few steps in the wrong direction before realizing his mistake and scrambling toward Jessen, but it was too late. I'm not sure how long Jessen lived, but he was gone. He was the first person I saw killed by the enemy. The experience was numbing. We called in a medevac for his body, and then we had to do the hardest thing of all, get up and keep moving. There was no time to process, no time to grieve. The war didn't allow for that. The next chance we got, when we were back in a fire base, the chaplain came out and held a small memorial service for him. We stood there in a quiet group, heads bowed, and then we went back to our duties. You just had to deal with it and go back out on patrol the next day. You had to keep moving. And so we did. We kept moving until November 15th, 1967. That was the day the world came apart. We were moving in 2 columns through an area thick with hedgerows. It was a bad situation, one that offered perfect cover for an ambush. And that's exactly what they had waiting for us. I later learned the significance of that date. Exactly 2 years earlier, to the day, our same unit, Charlie Company, 1st of the 7th Cav, had been in the fight of its life in the Ia Drang Valley. It seemed that history was determined to repeat itself. The contact was sudden and brutal. The sniper in the bush was an expert. He let our point man pass him by and then opened up on the second man in our column. When 2 others ran to help, he cut them down too. When the point man from the other column ran over to support us, he killed him as well. In the space of a minute, he had taken down 5 of our men. We were pinned down, firing wildly at a foe we couldn't see. It was a guy from Guam named Castro who finally broke the stalemate. Castro loved hand grenades more than he loved to eat. He crawled along the edge of the hedgerow, inching his way toward the sniper's position. With a flick of his wrist, he tossed a fragmentation grenade over into the bush. The sharp crack of the explosion was followed by silence from the sniper's position. Castro had stopped him. I think he got a silver star for that, but the fight wasn't over. On our left flank, another platoon was trying to move up and help. Their platoon leader, Sergeant Peterson, was moving down a ditch line when another sniper, hidden further away, shot and killed him. The call came over the radio that Sergeant Pete was hit. Our company commander immediately sent our executive officer, Lieutenant Segerson, to take over the 3rd platoon. Segerson, trying to get to his men, dived into the same ditch where Peterson lay. The sniper killed him too. 7 men down. The chaos was absolute. Our platoon leader, Lieutenant Lane, the young hotshot from California, completely lost his composure. I could hear him on the radio, his voice cracking, screaming for help, for ammunition, for medevacs. He was crying. To see your commander, your leader, fall apart like that was a devastating blow. It shook us all to the core. But our company commander, Captain Lenhart, was a different breed. He was a West Point man with nerves of steel. I saw him run up, grab Lieutenant Lane, and physically throw him into a small depression in the ground. He got on top of him, talking to him, shaking him, forcing him to get his senses back. It was a brutal but necessary act of leadership in the middle of hell. Time lost all meaning. The initial firefight probably only lasted 30 minutes, but the tension that followed stretched for an eternity. We had a photographer with us that day from one of the major news agencies. It seemed like every time we had a photographer along, we made contact. It was like they were a bad luck charm. He started taking pictures of our dead and wounded, and we hated him for it. We got pretty verbal, expressing our feelings in no uncertain terms. It was a ghoulish violation, and we didn't appreciate it. As the afternoon wore on, the situation settled into a tense stalemate. The initial shooting stopped, but we knew they were still out there. The medevac and resupply helicopters started coming in, landing in a clearing to our rear. I was trying to call in mortar fire, but it was difficult to spot targets. One of my friends, a machine gunner named Michaelvich, had fired his M60 so much he'd melted the barrel. A new barrel came in on one of the choppers. As he and his ammo bearer ran back to get it, the enemy started dropping mortars into the landing zone. One landed close to him. He was hit by shrapnel and badly wounded. He never came back to the unit. As dusk began to fall, the tension mounted. We set up a hasty perimeter, expecting an attack at any moment. Fighter bombers from the Air Force started making runs out in front of us, coming in low. In the gathering twilight, I could see the streams of red tracer rounds arcing up from the ground as the partisans fired at the planes. It was a terrifyingly beautiful sight. To keep them from mounting a full-scale assault on us in the dark, our artillery batteries began firing illumination rounds. All night long, a flare would pop high above us, bathing the landscape in an eerie, flickering light. And just as it would burn out, another would take its place. We spent that entire night on high alert, staring into the dancing shadows, every nerve screaming. We stepped over a couple of their dead as we moved out the next morning, but most they had carried away in the night. We just had to get up and keep moving. Sometime after that, probably in December, they moved us north. We left the area around Chulai and went up to Camp Evans in the Huipu B area. I'd been in country for about 6 months. In early January, I got to go on R&R. I chose Hawaii. My wife flew out and met me in Honolulu. Seeing her after all that time was like stepping into another dimension. We rented a car and had a week together, a small slice of paradise. It was a surreal break from the war. Going back was strange. It wasn't as hard as the first time I'd left, because now I knew what I was getting into. I had more confidence. I knew the routines. I knew the risks. I felt like a veteran. I returned to Vietnam just as the 1968 Tet Offensive was kicking off. Of course, we didn't call it that at the time. To us, it was just a sudden, dramatic escalation in the fighting. The activity just got much worse. The Marines had been in a brutal siege in the city of Hue, and as they pushed the enemy out, Army units like ours were sent into the surrounding areas to hunt them down. We operated for a week or more in an area we called the TT Woods. It was a strange battlefield, a semi-urban landscape of small houses and hedgerows, all abandoned. The fighting was intense and sporadic. It was a hit-and-run war. They'd fire on us from a concealed position, we'd lay down a base of fire, and by the time we maneuvered to their position, they would be gone. It was a frustrating and deadly game of cat and mouse. One evening, late in the day, we got into a heavy firefight. The weather was closing in, a solid overcast of low clouds and fog. We took casualties, one staff sergeant killed, another man badly injured. But when we called for a medevac, they couldn't find us. The fog was too thick. It was the only time in my entire year that a medevac couldn't get in. We had medics, of course, and they were well trained. They attended to the wounded man all night, doing the best they could. We spent another incredibly tense night, this time with our dead and wounded beside us. The artillery once again keeping the darkness at bay with a constant stream of illumination flares. The choppers finally got in at first light the next morning to take them out. We took more casualties in the days that followed. One afternoon, they started lobbing mortars on us instead of using small arms. Shrapnel was flying everywhere. One of my best buddies was struck and sustained a serious facial wound. We medevaced him out, and I never saw him again. The pressure was constant, grinding us down day by day. As we moved into late February and early March, our area of operations shifted closer to the coast, to an area of white sand dunes. By this point, I had about 75 or 80 days left in my tour. I decided to apply for a rear job at the Battalion Control Center, the TOC. I interviewed with the Master Sergeant, a man named Furchess, and gave Captain Lenhart, my old CO, as a reference. Lenhart was no longer with our company. He was working at Battalion. But before Sergeant Furchess could talk to him, our unit had to rotate back out to the field for a 2-week period. I left for the field thinking my chances of getting the job were slim. Those 2 weeks were the worst of my entire tour. While I was out, Captain Lenhart was on a walk with a group from the Teok when someone stepped on a landmine. Lenhart was badly injured and evacuated. He never came back. I was sick about it. Not only had a good man been hurt, but my reference was gone. I was sure they'd give the job to someone else. Then our platoon had its own encounters with landmines. We were walking a trail through the sandy soil. About a platoon and a half of men had already crossed this one spot. We stopped for a moment, and the guy behind me said something. I turned to see what he wanted, and as I pivoted, my boot kicked something in the sand. I felt it. I looked down and saw wires sticking out of the ground. My blood ran cold. I could have fainted right there. It was a pressure release device, a toe popper. If I had stepped on it and then lifted my foot, it would have been all over. Demolitions came and blew it in place. Just 30 or 40 minutes later, as we moved further down the same trail, my best friend Doc Gutierrez, the medic who had rushed to Jessen's side months before, stepped off the trail for a moment. He hit a booby-trapped landmine. It killed him instantly. By the time we rotated back to the fire base at the end of those 2 weeks, my nerves were completely shot. I had seen too much, been too close too many times. I walked up to the battalion talk, fully expecting the job to be filled, but it was still open. I got it. I never went back to the field again. My job for the last couple of months of my tour was as a clerk typist in the talk. I typed up the daily reports and after-action reports, helped with a little construction on the bunker that housed our operations, and generally stayed out of trouble. I moved from the constant danger of the field to the relative safety of a large base camp. But even in the rear, the war had a way of finding you. The enemy had a mountain range several miles from our base camp, Camp Evans. On Sunday mornings, they liked to get up in the edge of those mountains and lob 122mm Russian-made rockets into our camp. One Sunday, I was sitting in the talk, a large tent set down in a 4-foot deep hole for protection. A communications bunker was built onto the back of it, housing all the radios, powered by noisy gasoline generators. A rocket came in and scored a direct hit on that commo bunker. It killed one guy instantly. An officer standing in the doorway had his leg broken. The concussion from the blast slammed me against the wall. I felt a sharp sting in my left arm. I'd been hit by shrapnel. It wasn't a serious wound, but it was enough. I walked down to the aid station, got an X-ray, and they determined it was just a small piece of metal embedded in the muscle near my elbow. They decided it would do more damage to go in after it than to just leave it. I still have it to this day, a tiny souvenir of that Sunday morning. The clerk at the aid station filled out a piece of paper recommending me for a Purple Heart. I turned it into the battalion clerk, but the paperwork got lost in the shuffle. Nothing ever came of it. At the time, I had a pretty sorry attitude about it. I didn't care about the medal. I just wanted to go home. I had a calendar I'd made from a piece of a C ration box when I first arrived. It was numbered 1 to 365. Every day I'd mark one off, counting down the time. In the field, the days flew by, filled with movement and adrenaline. In the rear, time began to drag. Every day felt like a week. Getting closer to my Deros, my departure date, was something I lived for. It was the only thing that mattered. A few days before I was scheduled to leave, my official orders came through. I was going home. The night before we left, we had a little party for the guys who were rotating out. We managed to get our hands on some beer, which was no small feat, and had a little celebration. The next morning, we processed out of the country at Cam Ranh Bay, a massive logistical hub. The flight back was long. We flew from Vietnam to Tokyo for a refueling stop. It was night, and I could see the lights of the city spread out below, a world away from the darkness I had just left. We didn't even get off the plane. From Tokyo, we flew nonstop to Seattle. As the plane lifted off the runway in Vietnam and cleared the coast, a cheer went up. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated relief. We landed at Fort Lewis, Washington. They fed us a steak dinner, issued us new dress green uniforms, and booked us on flights to our hometowns. I didn't experience any of the protests or bad receptions you hear about. The people I met in the airports were cordial, interested. On the last leg of my flight from Los Angeles to Amarillo, the plane made a couple of stops. It was getting late, and the stewardess, seeing my uniform, let my friend and me sit in first class. It was a small kindness that meant the world. I landed in Amarillo in the middle of the night. My wife and family were all there. waiting for me right on the tarmac as I walked down the steps of the plane. It was over. I was home.